A beautiful Holy African family. This is another edition of the African Liberation Media Show. I'm your host, Brother Amos, and I'm here with my esteemed elder, Baba Makaru. How you doing today, Baba Makaru?
Hey, every day is a blessing, brother. Almost every day is a blessing. Glad to be able to communicate with our people once again via the African Liberation Media Podcast.
I say. We're coming up on the official date of Juneteenth, which is celebrated in the month of June, June 19th. And we are lucky to have one of the best Juneteenth historians who's actually been the Juneteenth historian here in the Charlotte community for decades, Baba Makaru, who has been presenting this information long before it has been popularized, as many of us know it now, amongst many of our people. So today he's going to share a little bit of information about Juneteenth and what is freedom.
Santa Sana, brother Almost. Yes, I have written an article which is going to appear in the next issue of the County News, which actually is coming out today. This is the article that one of the articles I wrote from last year. And we are in a struggle, as the great psychologist Dr. Wade Noble said, to define our reality rather than having it defined by others. Define our history, define things based on our own image and interest. And the title of the article that I've written for this week is called Juneteenth 2023, What is Freedom? Because the name most often associated with Juneteenth is freedom. You see it on banners, you hear it in speeches, and this is the word that people use. But unfortunately, most of the time when people are using this word and associating with Juneteenth, they are not clearly defining what they mean by freedom, because it can lead to certain misconceptions. So I would just like to say, first of all, we should define, what these terms are, what Juneteenth is, based on our analysis of history. The very first confusion is the dates. June 19th, 1865 is the date that people identify with Juneteenth, but the first Juneteenth was not celebrated until June 19th, 1866. And I'll explain where the June 19th, 1865 comes from. But first, I just want to give a general definition from the perspective of those of us who operate on the basis of the liberation and empowerment of African people. Juneteenth is first and foremost a celebration of the heroic struggle that were waged by African people for 246 years against chattel slavery. They arrived at the position of celebrating Juneteenth on June 19th, 1866, because that was the place in Texas where the announcement was first made by a representative of the United States Army that the Emancipation Proclamation was now in effect, when they arrived there on June 19th, 1865. We have to make sure we are very specific when we're talking about these dates to keep them separated. On June 19th, 1866, the people who had been emancipated in Texas gathered on Galveston Island to celebrate Juneteenth, which was also known as Emancipation Day, Liberation Day, and Jubilee Day in its early days. That gathering became the event that we celebrate today as Juneteenth. The historical context of what we are celebrating becomes critically important. For those of us focused on the liberation and empowerment of African people, Juneteenth is more about the agency of African people to liberate themselves than it is about the machinations of empire politicians like Abraham Lincoln and others. Juneteenth is a celebration of the heroic struggle of African people to make chattel slavery the paramount issue in 19th century America in order to resolve it. Thus, Juneteenth is first and foremost a celebration of African resistance to chattel slavery. Now, our esteemed ancestor, Dr. Amos N. Wilson, taught us that all commemorations must lead to a transformation of our consciousness of the power relations and of the power relations on this planet. Otherwise, what are we doing? Just getting together to have a good time? I mean, yeah, look, people enjoy, we should come together and celebrate our culture and all of the things that we have achieved and the fact that we are still here. But Dr. Wilson goes for, he says it must all of these celebrations, whatever we're celebrating, Malcolm X Day, Martin Luther King Day, Marcus Garvey Day, Kwanzaa, whatever we're celebrating, it must lead to a transformation of our consciousness because we're still in a struggle for liberation and empowerment. False definitions and narratives hinder this process. We must become more original and creative in defining who we are, what we have done and can do. Juneteenth must be viewed as part of the African struggle for liberation and empowerment. In the context of that struggle, when we celebrate Juneteenth, we absorb the spirit of our ancestors who struggled against chattel slavery. And we certainly need, given what we're facing in the United States in 2023 and really across the planet, we certainly need to absorb the spirit of our ancestors. When we celebrate Juneteenth, we absorb the spirit of Mum Bet, Elizabeth Freeman, the first enslaved African to file and win freedom via a lawsuit in Massachusetts. We absorb the spirit of the 1739 Stonewall Rebellion in South Carolina. We absorb the spirit of the Prosser brothers, Gabriel, Solomon, and Martin, who planned their revolt in Virginia in 1800. We absorb the spirit of Charles Deslandes and the 1811 German Coast Uprising in Louisiana. We absorb the spirit of Denmark Vesey, Gullah Jack Pritchard, and all of the Africans in the planned 1822 rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina. We absorb the spirit of David Walker in his 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world. We absorb the spirit of Nat Turner and his 1831 rebellion. We absorb the spirit of Maria Stewart and Frances Ellen Harper Watkins and their spoken words against slavery, and their spoken and written words against slavery. It's actually Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She has that long name, so I get it mixed up sometimes. We absorb the spirit of Harriet Tubman, her numerous trips to free enslaved Africans, and the successful 1863 Combahee River raid she planned that liberated over 700 enslaved Africans in South Carolina. We absorb the spirit of the Gullah people who fled to Florida and fought the United States Army alongside indigenous peoples in 3 wars between 1816 and 1858. We absorb the spirit of countless others, known and unknown, who continuously escaped from slavery, forcing the United States government to enact 3 separate laws to capture and return enslaved Africans who liberated them. Of course, you had the Fugitive Slave Clause in the 1787 U.S. Constitution. A few years later, in 1793, they passed the Fugitive Slave Law. And then in 1850, they passed the draconian Fugitive Slave Act. And so you always get this struggle, this imposition, our enslavers and their descendants try to impose on us the idea that our ancestors were docile and peaceful. But if that's the case, why was it necessary for the government to pass 3 consecutive, three separate slave laws, fugitive slave laws? If our people were just, satisfied and pacified being on these horrendous plantations of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry and Andrew Jackson and others. We absorb the spirit of Dred and Harriet Scott, whose legal challenges for their freedom resulted in the 1857 Dred Scott decision. Initially, there were 2 lawsuits. Dred Scott filed a lawsuit, and then Harriet Scott, his wife, filed a lawsuit, but they combined them into 1 lawsuit, and that led that ruling was one of the key factors which led to the Civil War. We absorbed the spirit of Dangerfield Newby, Shields Green, Lewis Leary, John Copeland, and Osborne Anderson, who joined John Brown and his sons in their assault on slavery at Harper's Ferry in 1859. So, this is what we mean when we say African agency, because basically a lot of people would like to condense the whole process of slavery to the emancipation to just Abraham Lincoln in 1863, without including, Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and the Stono Rebellion and Mum Bet, and Mariah Stewart and David Walker and others. So, that's what we mean when we say that it's a product of African agency versus the machinations of empire politicians who were trying to save the American empire, as an intact entity, based on, what they had accomplished up to that point. So you got any questions or anything about that part of it, Brother Amos?
Well, just to add on to what you said about how people subsequently forget about prior to 1863, all of the skirmishes, wars, and battles that took place on the front lines by Africans that contributed to what led up to 1863 and 1865. And I remember having a discussion with a guy probably about maybe 7 years ago. And we were talking about some solutions for today. And of course, he said that, us liberating ourselves using physical force is not going to work, and it's never worked for us. That basically is what the summary of his comments were. And he tried to say that when Africans rebelled, they were just small little skirmishes, but it never was a war against the European. And of course, I mentioned the Haitian Revolution, which he was unfamiliar with. But even when he became familiar with that, he took the notion of where that's just an outlier. But I think that part of our history is often fragmented by a lot of historians.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good that you put it together from a holistic perspective, because all of those fights, all of those battles are connected to the entire struggle for liberation of African people.
Exactly. And when I wrote this last year, I just focused on the struggles here, in what is now the United States. I failed to mention the enormous impact that the Haitian Revolution had, not only in terms of the fear that it struck in the slaveocracy, in the enslavers of Thomas Jefferson and others, and of course the inspiration that it provided for people like Denmark Vesey, right, whose first stop on the way, maybe his second stop on the way from Africa was on the island of Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
And so people were aware. Our people in this country were aware.
Mm-hmm.
People, for example, often mention, escaping from the United States to Haiti. So Haiti was very important, of course, and it led directly to the Louisiana Purchase and the vast expansion, of the what became the United States. So I'm glad you brought that up, because when I wrote this, I was just focused on making people aware of, the different forms of struggle that had taken place here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so moving on to to what I've written for the topic for this year. As I said earlier, the word we hear most often during celebrations of Juneteenth is freedom. Now we hear more and more independence. Independence was not one of the original words I read. The original ways our people defined the Jubilee. They often associated Jubilee with, liberation from slavery. They had Liberation Day, Emancipation Day, Freedom Day, etc. And now with this bill that was signed by Nero Joe Biden in June of 2021, the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act. You hear the word independence. I'll come back and deal with that briefly in a moment. That wasn't necessarily the focus of what I was writing about, this year, but in this particular article, I am going to write another article on that law, probably for next week. So that's the word we hear most often. Rarely do people using the word freedom define what it means other than being released or freed from slavery. Our African ancestors of 1860s had a clear understanding of what freedom meant to them. In fact, they had a better understanding of 1860 than we have today in terms of a mass-based understanding. Okay. After all, many of them were no more than 2 or 3 generations removed from living free, proud, and productive lives on the African continent. And this is why you had this continuous resistance, continuous rebellions, because our people, even if you say you were Nat Turner, born in 1800 in Virginia, his grandmother told him what it was like to live as a free person, because she came from the African continent. According to some sources, a Coromantee African. So via our oral traditions, this knowledge was being passed down. So, and we are far removed from that, unfortunately. As anthropologist Dr. Marimba Ani explains it, we came from a culture of tremendous order, which provided us with a viable belief system and which guided behavior and moral interrelationship, family closeness, sharing life with the community and friends, participation in communal structures, sacred rituals, communion with our ancestors, and contact with the ancestral land meant everything. So here Dr. Ani is explaining just some of the things that were part of our culture, that right now, it seems more is under more of an assault now than it was, during chattel slavery. Family closeness, sharing of life with the community and friends. I mean, all these kinds of things, connection to the ancestral land. Chattel slavery shattered the African worldview, but it was not totally forgotten. Oral traditions kept parts of it alive in the memory banks of our ancestors. Having known what freedom was became one of the factors driving continuous resistance to and rebellions against chattel slavery by the enslaved Africans. When given the opportunity to define freedom, our ancestors presented a clear definition. On January 12, 1865, in Savannah, 20 Black leaders met with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and General William T. Sherman. Secretary Stanton posed a series of questions, and formerly enslaved 67-year-old Reverend Garrison Frazier was chosen to speak for the leaders. Stanton, this is the question he posed: what is slavery, and define the freedom provided by the Emancipation Proclamation? Reverend Frazier, check how concise this brother is. Check how concise this brother purchased his own freedom for himself and his wife. He had been obviously he was a skilled, what was called a skilled slave. We had there are various categories of slaves. Most often people just think we're just, working in the fields, but there were industrial, enslaved Africans. There were skilled enslaved Africans. For example, those who Thomas Jefferson decided that farming tobacco wasn't profitable, so he constructed a nail factory because people were building homes and you needed nails to keep the homes together. So he had skilled enslaved Africans producing the nails in his factory, which he sold. Now, I don't know if he, in some instances where people were able to go to work, an enslaver may have allowed them to keep a small percentage of their money, 1%, 2%, 3%. But somehow Reverend Frazier had accumulated some gold and silver. And he was actually here in North Carolina before he moved to Savannah and became a minister. And so, I just wanted to give that little background on him. I'm assuming that he was a skilled or an industrial in North Carolina. Probably he was doing some type of skilled work, for his enslavers, and then accumulating money, which he saved because he said, "I'm going to purchase my freedom and my wife's freedom." So this is what this brother said when Stanton asked him the question. He said, "Slavery is receiving by irresistible power the work of another man and not by his consent. The freedom, as I understand it, promised by the proclamation is taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor, take care of ourselves, and assist the government in maintaining our freedom." Stanton, state in what manner you think you can best take care of yourselves and how you can best assist the government in maintaining your freedom. Reverend Frazier, the best way we can take care of ourselves is to have land and to turn it and till it by our own labor, and to assist the government in maintaining our freedom. The young men should enlist in the service of the government and serve in such a manner as they may be wanted. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. So you see this idea, this connection, back to what Dr. Ani said about connection with the ancestral land. They knew that they were producing enormous profits for the enslavers. So they said, "We're doing the work. Give us land. We can work for ourselves. You won't even have to worry about us." Okay, now, hold on a minute, because there was one other part I wanted to read, which I think is very important. Stanton asked, I don't have this in the article, but I have it, from another document. State in what manner you would rather live, whether scattered among whites or in colonies by yourselves. Reverend Frazier, I would prefer to live by ourselves, as there is prejudice against us in the South that would take years to get over. But I don't know that I can answer for my brethren. So Stanton asked the 20, do you all want to live separately? 19 of the 20 agreed with what Reverend Frazier positioned. So here you have a group of brothers and sisters in the 1860s who had concepts of independence, living on land, taking care of ourselves. I'll go back to the article now, but I just wanted to throw that in because, this whole idea of separation is not anything new. General Sherman responded to the black leaders by issuing Special Field Order number 15. Under the terms of the military edict, the demand for land was immediately addressed. More than 400,000 acres of land abandoned by Confederate owners on the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands and along the coast was set aside for black settlement and temporary possession. Plots of 40 acres per family were proposed, and following the wisdom of the black ministers, Sherman's order also directed that no whites, except necessary military personnel or others in helping roles, were to reside in the new black settlements. Per the Zen Project, within 6 months, 40,000 black people who had been enslaved lived on 400,000 acres of coastal land. They used their skills and labor to make the land productive. They also set up their own civic and educational institutions, and they established their own militia to protect themselves from the Klan. For our ancestors, freedom signified self-determination, owning land, reaping the benefits of their labor, building their own communities, and having armed black men to protect their interest. That's how they define freedom. Crystal clear. Any comments on that, Brother Amos, before I go to the next part?
No, go ahead. Keep rolling.
Okay. All right. So now we move it. So this is January of 1865. Okay. The U.S. Army arrives on Galveston Island and makes an announcement on June 19th, 1865. And so what I want our audience to do is compare Sherman's Field Order 15 versus the order that was issued by General Granger, General Order number 3, which was read to the Africans in the Galveston area in, I think, 6 different locations on June 19th, 1865. Juneteenth gets its name from June 19th, 1865, the day a U.S. military unit commanded by General Gordon Granger reached Galveston, Texas. Granger read his General Order number 3 to the enslaved Africans. This is what his order says. The people are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. The connection heretofore existing between them becomes that of employer to hired labor. The freed are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. There's no evidence that General Granger met with black leaders to get their input, as opposed to what happened with Sherman and Stanton. The order that he issued would lead to the creation of vagrancy laws. No, I moved ahead. Hold on a minute. There's no evidence that Granger met with black leaders to get their input. He defined freedom for them. General Order number 3 offered no land. Instead of land, the formerly enslaved were told to rearrange their economic relationship with their former masters. What was master and slave should become employer to employee. So the Africans that met with Stanton and Sherman defined what freedom was. Here, the U.S. representative of the U.S. government is defining what freedom is. That's a major difference. Dr. W. Martin Delaney said, Granger was warning them against idleness. That order would lead to the creation of vagrancy laws and black codes that would be wielded against black people, forcing many into labor without pay. In other words, Granger order established the conditions of what would become sharecropping, peonage, convict leasing, and apprenticeship. In other words, slavery by another name. Now, I don't know if this guy was looking that far ahead or not in terms of saying, okay, you're released from chattel slavery, but we have another system of oppression coming for you. But that's certainly what he set up in this particular order. Okay. The balance of power shifted in Washington after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And the person who I consider to be the worst vice president in U.S. history, and that's saying a lot when you consider Spiro Agnew and some of the others, Andrew Johnson, who was actually too drunk to attend the inauguration, a former enslaver, why Abraham Lincoln picked him to be his running mate for his second term. I haven't researched that. Maybe I should go read through Lerone Bennett's book more carefully. But he was the absolute worst person to be in this position because there were a group of white Republicans in the Congress called the Radical Republicans who held power and who actually wanted to punish the Confederates and give 40 acres and a mule. You know, they passed this in the Freedmen's Bureau Act. Okay. Lincoln is assassinated. Andrew Johnson becomes president, and he immediately begins to overturn everything that had been put in place. Less than a year after Sherman's order, President Andrew Johnson intervened in order that the vast majority of confiscated land be returned to its former owners. This included most of the land that the freedmen had settled. The federal government dispossessed tens of thousands of black landowners. In Georgia and South Carolina, some blacks fought back, driving away former owners with guns, but federal troops sometimes evicted blacks by force. You have a shift of power. Okay. So Sherman's order was overturned, but some black people still are on that land today. They call the Gullah Geechee people. Still own some of that land that was granted to them. I remember we used to have, when I was in the Student Organization for Black Unity, we used to have meetings down in Frogmore where Dr. King held a lot of his retreats. It's a black still owned that particular territory, that was granted, given to them in 1865. And the way they were able to keep it was because they had an armed militia that was able to fight off the Confederate enslavers who returned and had, were operating on the basis of this clemency given to them by Andrew Johnson. Freedom is also defined as the capacity to make choices. What choices are available, for example, to people who have been wrongfully convicted and are released from prison without any compensation or restitution? The person wrongfully convicted is no longer incarcerated. He or she is free from prison, but the wrongfully convicted person or people have not been returned to the position they were in before the wrongful act occurred. That's what restitution is. The attempt to return you to the position that you were originally in. This is what reparations are. It's a step towards that, returning African people to our original position, free, proud, and productive people. Simply releasing people from bondage does not equate to freedom.
Mm-hmm.
This is why we have to clearly define what we mean when we are saying these words. There is no, when you have been wrongfully convicted, wrongfully enslaved, forced to work and produce massive profits, the enslaved were more valuable than the railroads, the banks. The only thing more valuable was the land in the 1860s. The only thing more valuable than the gross national product produced by the enslaved was the land, and the land was only valuable in many instances because the Africans were working it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So that's why we have to be crystal clear. All history is a current event, Dr. John Henry Clark. When we are using the word freedom in the context of Juneteenth, we should be using it based on the standards established by our ancestors. Otherwise, we're using false definitions and narratives. However, Juneteenth celebrations cannot be, as Dr. Wilson observed, obsessed with the past to the exclusion of the present. Let me repeat that. Juneteenth celebrations cannot be, as Dr. Amos Wilson observed, obsessed with the past to the exclusion of the present. As Kwame Nkrumah said, each historical situation produces its own dynamics. And adaptive vitality based on our current understanding of the past is required to deal with the current conditions we are dealing with and to shape our future. So, that will be, I'll be speaking down there at the Juneteenth Festival of the Carolinas in the Plaza Midwood area, House of Africa, on Saturday. What's that? June the 17th. And, these will be the points that I'll be making because, we are in a struggle to define our reality. And particularly since Joe Biden, Nero Joe Biden, right? New Jim Crow Joe Biden, Crime Bill Joe Biden, since he signed this bill that was entitled, and the title of the bill itself is just an absolute contradiction to reality. The title of the bill that he signed to make Juneteenth a federal holiday is Juneteenth National Independence Day. What independence? Okay, first of all, the insertion of the word independence, obviously done by some neo-colonial agents or assimilationists, and the Democrats and Republicans in Congress who saw this as an opportunity to give us another token acknowledgement. I believe that there was an attempt here to connect. There was an obvious attempt to connect Juneteenth to July 4th, because July 4th is known as Independence Day for the United States. But any connection between Juneteenth and July the 4th is a historically flawed analogy. There is no connection. The United States is independent because they have power to maintain, what they were able to take from their cousins in England and what they stole through a genocidal war. The land they stole from the indigenous people via genocidal war, and the land they stole from, and the labor they stole from us via the daily terror of chattel slavery. I mean, July the 4th is a celebration of the victory of one group of genocidal Europeans over another. What independence the African people have in this country? I mean, in less than a year, the Field Order 15 was overturned. Now, once the radical Republicans were able to get rid of Andrew Johnson and put Ulysses S. Grant in as president, they were able to enact some other things, including 40 acres and a mule, and based on the Freedmen's Bureau Act, some Black people did in fact get land. In fact, where do I have it here? I got it somewhere. About the amount of land Black people were able to accumulate by the year 1900. I got it in one of these articles. I have to find it, but I'll put it in the notes. So, but generally speaking, what Granger set up became part of the assault, because what independence do you have when Reconstruction is overthrown, when nearly 4,500 Africans are lynched, between the end of chattel slavery and up through the 1950s, Emmett Till and others. What independence do you have when you have to deal with the Red Summer of 1919, the destruction of the communities you build in places like Wilmington, North Carolina, and Rosewood, Florida, and Ocoee, Florida, right? I mean, so it's an absolute hypocrisy, but once again, it's an attempt to define reality, to define our reality, to move to define it in a way that it doesn't contribute to our liberation and empowerment. In other words, accept our definition, join in with the commercialization of the holiday, go out and spend your money, party, do whatever, and none of what Dr. Amos Wilson talked about becomes a factor. And that's why I stay in the struggle. A lot of people say, why are you in there? I stay in the struggle because somebody has to try to continue to wage the fight to define our reality. And, we know that the people with correct ideas don't always have the balance of power to make our ideas a reality, but we have to keep planting the seeds because we believe that our correct ideas at some point in history, will come to fruition. So, that's some of my thoughts on that, Brother Amos.
Definitely. And one of the things that I've heard you say in the past is when referring to African people who were enslaved by Europeans through the Ma'afa, referring to them as enslaved Africans versus slaves. And this is one of the problems that I have with people who often refer to our ancestors as just slaves,
Right.
because that really takes away your argument for reparations. Because if these people were merely slaves, what would they be repaired to? So I think it's more important for us to notate, as you stated earlier, about the skilled labor. Many, if not most, of these Africans who were taken from the African continent possess highly valuable skills, whether that be cultivation of crops, whether that be knowing how to manipulate metal and being a blacksmith. Many of these skills that were profitable to the European, these people were taken from their homeland and brought to the Americas to produce profits based on the skills that they possess. And we oftentimes lower our ancestors' value by not referring to them as highly skilled enslaved Africans. Many historians who try to make Black people believe and feel as though we gained something by being enslaved in America because we had nothing before that. And once again, that decreases your argument for reparations. These Africans possess these skill sets on the African continent, which is why when you look at something specifically like the cultivation of rice, which was done in West Africa, was then brought to the Americas and was a highly profitable crop, especially in South Carolina, where they had many rice plantations. In fact, the rice plantations, in some cases, were more profitable in South Carolina than the cotton plantations
Right.
and the tobacco plantations.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a important fact to remember. And also, when we look at how our culture is displayed or taught to us, when you refer to Africans, highly skilled Africans who have been enslaved, as just slaves, we get the depictions in Hollywood and in the movies of Africans who have been enslaved as just only possessing or practicing slave culture.
Mm.
And we rarely see that connection. In some films, they show it. There's a good film called The Assailant, and it's about post-slavery in Brazil, where Black people were still being oppressed in Brazil and forced to work, even though slavery had ended in the Americas. and you can see them practicing capoeira, or you can see them practicing other African spirituality throughout that film. And we look at most of the slave movies that are presented to us in the United States, when we do see the Africans who are beating the drum or practicing some type of African culture, in many cases is relegated to small scenes or primarily focused on Islamic culture or something of that nature. But rarely do we see, people practicing traditional West African cultures primarily like they were doing. Like when you talk about the Gullah Geechee people, we talk about Africans who were enslaved throughout the Caribbean, practicing those cultures, and in some cases in the Americas in secret and maintaining that culture. So when you talk about repairing a people to what they were, we have to remember that these people tried to hold on and maintain their culture as long as they possibly could, without being forced for it to be stripped from them, as it was specifically in the United States.
Exactly. The enslaved versus slaved. I think it's so critically important because I remember I was able to avoid any I went to segregated schools my entire career until I graduated from West Charlotte. I remember some of the younger people who got caught up in forced busing and things like that. uh, I remember them telling me stories about sitting in classrooms with white people, white students, white teachers, when they discuss slavery, quote unquote. They never use the term chattel slavery, and I always try to use chattel slavery because there have been different forms of slavery throughout history. And they would refer to slaves, and the black children would feel embarrassed. Their sense of pride
Mm-hmm.
that perhaps had been developed in our segregated schools was under assault they because of the way the teachers were teaching the story.
Mm-hmm.
It made them think that, well, that's all you ever were, that's where you came from. And so I've always in my talks to young people tried to reinforce this idea that our people, we were free people who were enslaved. Now, we know that there was a form of slavery, on the continent of Africa, in West Africa. Sheikh Anta Diop deals with this in pre-colonial Africa. He calls slavery the bane of Africa because the fact that sometimes it was the result of, it may have been called slavery, but it was punishment for a crime which someone had committed. Somebody stole somebody's, crop of sweet potatoes or something to that effect. Or, we don't try to paint this idea that everything was, all just, glory. There were struggles, in Africa over resources among African people. But that's our business.
Mm-hmm.
Europeans have always done this. If one group of people had gold and others didn't, maybe okay. So, and sometimes the captives of these wars became enslaved for a period of time, but it wasn't permanent, and there was no cultural stigma because all the people were African.
Mm-hmm.
But it's quite different from what the slavery that was practiced amongst those who became collaborators, right? Such as the homie, You saw this in the Woman King.
And to your point, not
Although
only
they twisted it to make it more positive, but the fact of the matter is, Africans, the capture of Africans to be sold to Europeans became a business
mm-hmm.
for some African groups. But as Dr. Leonard Jeffries always reminds us, don't ever forget, it originated with the Europeans coming to Africa, that particular form of slavery. So that's the point that I always try to say. Our original position on the African continent, prior to the coming of, first the Arabs, then the Europeans, were free, proud, productive people. And in some instances, such as, ancient Kemet, Kush, the empires of the Western Sudan, free, proud, productive, powerful. And when you look at Mali and Kemet, prosperous. Okay. And, Mansa Musa becomes the example of that. But Mansa Musa obviously spread his wealth because you don't see any gold mansions anywhere in Mali that Mansa Musa built for himself to live in.
Mm-hmm.
So, even though they also had, some people that were in a class that some would call, forced labor. So, but that's our own business. However we were handling our affairs is our business. But the point is, when we talk about the world's largest forced migration, beginning after the disaster of 1492, you're talking about people who were free, proud, productive, and who were enslaved. And that's why that term is so important.
Yeah, I was going to add to your point about the life ownership or permanent ownership. It also included the ownership of someone's offspring. So if that person was to have children under the European chattel slavery, then that person would also be owned by the same person that owned their mother or their father. And a lot of the introduction of these types of slave practices really was introduced by the Arabs during the Arab slave trade of the African continent, even before the European came into the picture.
Right. Yeah. To just validate your point, in 1661 and 1662, the legislature in the British colony of Virginia, it was called the House of Burgesses, passed laws that said that the status of children would be that of their mothers. Now, this is a law that was passed in Virginia in 1661, 1662. The primary motivation for passing the law, in addition to making the condition permanent, was because white men were raping so many enslaved African women that their children should be, based on English law, entitled to the condition of the father.
That's a good point.
So they passed a very specific law in Virginia, in the Virginia colony, the British colony of Virginia, that said the condition of the child becomes that of the mother. That meant perpetual slavery. Perpetual slavery. And another argument I run into, people will say, well, the first Africans that arrived were indentured servants. And I said, first of all, when the 20 and odd arrived, They were aboard the White Lion. They had been aboard a Portuguese ship, the San João Batista, which left Angola and was en route to Mexico. They were hijacked by British pirates because the British at this time primarily were not going to the African continent. They were hijacking ships that came across and forcing them to give them ransom. And so these two ships, the White Lion and the Treasurer, they intercepted the Batista, and the ransom in order to continue the trip was about 50 Africans, along with some other products. So these two British pirate ships left the Caribbean and headed to the colony in Jamestown, but actually they arrived at a place. What an odd name for an enslaved person. The name of the actual place they arrived was called Point Comfort, but the area was called Jamestown. So when they arrived, the governor of Virginia and the Cape merchant, and this is recorded by John Rolfe, purchased the 20 captives, the 20 enslaved Africans who had originated in Angola and were en route to Mexico. So they purchased them and then distributed them to the settlers. Some of those people did become indentured servants, but the status of all of them has never been determined. So the evidence suggests that some of the original 20 and odd plus the 30 that arrived shortly afterwards were enslaved from the very beginning. But if you look at what an indentured servant was, it was a person in England who signed a contract. These were either people that were criminals, people who were, poor or destitute or whatever, and they signed a contract because they had massive unemployment after the breakup of feudalism. They had massive unemployment, throughout Europe. People crowded into the cities, and these cities like Amsterdam and London became very violent communities, just like we see in many inner cities here in the United States today, had very high homicide rates. So people would sign these contracts to work for 7 years, and then they could become free, quote unquote free. So they were voluntarily coming. No one in Angola would volunteer to leave Angola and sign a contract to come work in a British colony or a Spanish colony or a Portuguese colony or a French colony, in North, South America, or the Caribbean. You have no reason to leave Angola. You're free and you're proud and you're productive. So when they use the term, I always have to try to explain that nobody signed a contract in any part of Africa to come to the United States and be an indentured servant. We're not living in the conditions that people were living in London in the 1600s, where you had extremely high homicide rates, massive poverty, massive unemployment. Okay? So, but some did become indentured servants, and actually, in the case of this one very famous person that they know about, his name became Anthony Johnson, actually became a large owner of land and an enslaver of his own people. So, that's part of the history. And, Barack Obama, the African ancestor that they connect him to John Punch was captured in Cameroon and forced into indentured servitude, escaped with two other white men. They were punished, and John Punch's punishment was permanent servitude. The two white men were given a few extra years onto whatever their contract was, but eventually he married a white indentured servant, or not married, had children by them, and these children eventually kept intermingling with other white people till they became quote unquote white, and this eventually led to Barack Obama's white American mother. So, that's just another piece of history that we should be aware of.
But brother, we definitely thank you for giving us that heap of information, and we are coming up on Juneteenth. Looking forward to hearing you speak this Saturday. Um, I'll try to be out there, and brothers and sisters, definitely leave your comments down in the comment section. Like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, and make sure that you hit the notification bell so that every time we upload a video, you'll be notified. Until next time, Habibi Fahodier.
Habibi Fahodier.